What I was going to suggest, Jeff, before we get into questions, whether you want to just list, not the whole 10, the extra myths.
Yeah. Well, there are any number of them, going from, if I can remember them, going from population, right, which is for some people the source of all evil in terms of the environmental debate. You know, it's people that are the problem, ranging right through to issues like the use of the precautionary principle in policy making. It deals with issues of agriculture and mining. Often agriculture and mining are portrayed as the evil exploiters of the natural environment. I contend that not to be the case, and actually try to demonstrate that mining and agriculture are actually playing a pretty good role in environmental management, especially in this country. So we go through issues associated with a whole heap of. No. Coming back to me. I mean, one of the other pet hates at the moment, and I'm sorry, I'm being grumpy old man again, is this the use of indices to help guide us in our consumption choices. Things like food miles. Have you come across food miles? And you've got to eat local. You've got to look at your carbon footprint, right? Or you've got to look at the whole ecological footprint. So these things, because they focus on just particular dimensions of resource use, often ignore the broader impacts on the use of scarce resources, which, you know, my argument is that let's use prices to define the relative scarcity of these. I mean, there's a classic case in New Zealand. Of course, New Zealand is very hurt by food miles because they're a long way from anywhere. And of course, the New Zealand agricultural economists got pretty worried about this, so they started to actually do the footprinting. Right? So how many tonnes of greenhouse gases are there emitted through the production of a lamb in the Canterbury Plains and exported to London, relative to the production of a lamb in Kent and eaten in London? And they were able to very convincingly show that the greenhouse footprint of the New Zealand lamb was less than the one that came from next door. And of course, on that, you know, one of the big issues is international trade, because of course trade is seen to be, again, if it's not population, it's trade and multinationals, etc., that are using up the world's scarce resources and creating all sorts of environmental harm. And, you know, this is where I get that line of wealth is good, because in fact it's trade that establishes wealth. And there's for those of you who are dyed-in-the-wool economists, of course, trade is based on specialisation, and what specialisation means is that you create goods and services at a lower cost, lower the requirements for major national policies, things like the broadband network, for instance, are just given prime ministerial consent to go ahead without being vetted using a cost-benefit analysis assessment. And that's what I'm arguing for.
You said you're not arguing about too much about how much the government has a role in environmental protection. I'd argue that perhaps it has way too much of a role, and I'm wondering if one of the topics in your book, which I haven't read yet, is whether public ownership of conservation land is necessary, or whether you can achieve a better outcome with private ownership.
Okay. Reid, I don't remember the number of the chapter, but there is a chapter in there on private sector provision of the environment. And one of my particular cause celebs is instilling more private enterprise initiative into the management of national parks. I'm not going so far as to advocate the sale of national parks. I think that would be politically disastrous. But I think the tendering of the management process for national parks is a sensible thing to do. I would be keen to follow the US example, which hasn't seemed to have led to the demise of the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone or any other icon site in the US, where they have accommodation available in the parks, where they have private tour operators organising visit functions in national parks. I think those are terrific mechanisms whereby we can piggyback the private sector profits that come from that sort of arrangement with the public good, which is the protection of endangered species, and not just charismatic megafauna, as they say, but the little bugs and the beetles and everything else that goes along with a national park status. It has to be carefully done. I mean, private-public partnerships, I think, in infrastructure provides us with some lessons on how that might be done. I think that the terms of a lease, how long a private sector manager has the responsibility for managing the sort of contractual conditions, are all interesting areas that just haven't been explored.
There's a state parliamentary inquiry.
Chapter 10.
There's a state parliamentary inquiry into public land management at the moment.
Is there?
You should send your chapter to it. There's 2 days to go.
Oh, right. Okay. Thanks for that. Yeah.
A couple of things on the biofuels. First, it's pretty obvious that the rise in food prices has exacerbated the hunger and starvation in Africa, and it's amazing to me that there isn't more press commentary on that issue, because it is so obvious. It's clear that if you cut out using the fuel, using the corn for fuel, you wouldn't necessarily transfer it all to Africa, but it certainly exacerbates that.
Yeah.
It's a direct thing. Right. And the other point on lack of publicity is Al Gore said, I think it was in January 2010, it conceded that the biofuels policy had been a big mistake, and that he'd gone for it primarily because he was interested in getting the Corn Belt vote in the presidential elections. And he conceded that. It wasn't, to my knowledge, reported anywhere in the paper. It just seems amazing.
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of interesting things happening because, of course, at the moment the US is just in the midst of a drought. So there are all sorts of impacts on global grain supplies just about to hit us. And already the futures market for wheat is responding to that, and canny wheat growers in Australia are already locking in prices for this season's harvest. But of course, with those elevated prices for grain, that's going to, of course, hit it even harder. And the irony, of course, is that the US may well be in a position that it has to import maize to create enough ethanol. It has already happened once, and it looks like it might happen. And by the way, whilst we talk about Al Gore, there is a chapter on climate change.
Okay, great.
Professor, thank you for your talk and for your courage in raising some of these issues that get the kind of response you got on the conversation. conversation, but I wonder if your courage failed you in the title of the book. It sounded to me like they were more like big. but more seriously, my question goes back to the earlier question about the appropriate role of markets versus government intervention. And you seem to suggest that there are some preconditions to using markets more effectively in this space, namely the need for a better definition of what you called environmental property rights. And I wonder if you could expand on what you mean by that and how that would help. Okay.
There is some movement at the station in this area. And in fact, a lot of the pollution literature starts to talk about setting up property rights. So setting up a total emissions quota for an area of, say, NOx, nitrous oxide or sulfur dioxide, and then marketing permits to pollute is a way of moving into this space whereby we're effectively providing an ownership to a right to the use of the atmosphere for pollution. There are markets being structured whereby farmers are being paid for their environmental services, right? Defining what those environmental services might be, and having ways of monitoring and enforcing contracts are still in very early days. And of course, why they're in early days is they're just these are examples of high transaction costs. And what you have to do in thinking about that mix between government and private is to think about just what the transaction costs are of establishing a market and whether or not the value to society of the trades that would take place in that market are enough to offset those transaction costs. Because if they don't, no trade will emerge and we're back to where we started.
But aren't those artificial markets in the sense that you've got a government creating an artificial constraint?
Well, I mean, you can
be created by the market itself.
You can argue that all markets are based on some sort of government constraint. I mean, we've got a legal system, a policing system that's fundamentally in government hands that enables the process of trade to take place.
So isn't that the next step, if you're talking of creating markets, is setting up, or how do we even move towards changing the bureaucracy and the way that NGOs and interest groups operate, so that you do really set the right price and create the right markets?
Jill, that's a really deep question, because it's asking me to,
sorry.
in a flash, solve the problems that Greg's been trying to address for the last.
That's your next book.
But I think what you point out is an absolutely relevant question. It goes back to the answer to the question before, on the issue of corruption in lots of nations. And I mean, you can argue that what's rent seeking in this country but a form of corruption. And what we have to do there is to look at processes in democratic society which address and counteract those sorts of forces. And CIS is part of that. I hope this book is part of that. It's the communal debate. It's the process whereby we send signals back to our politicians, our representatives, and send signals as to what we want from our decision-making processes, and transparency, and ensuring that whatever the government does, that it does in the interests of the society rather than the interests of particular vested interest groups. And I'm not picking on any particular vested interest groups here, right? You've got businesses who are in there, right? But you've also got green groups. I mean, people say, oh, green groups, they're not rent seekers, right? And people think of rent seeking as getting money. Right? But rents are not necessarily just money. I mean, rents are advantage to your interests. And it might be that the rents that you seek as an environmentalist is the protection or the setting aside of an area as a national park.